It's so good to see you. Welcome. So good you got here. I'm glad you got back from Washington. You're a busy fellow. It's so good to see you. Surprised me. It's so good to see you. And in the audience, pleasure to welcome to the program an old dear friend of conversations, that being Robert Blohm. And he's just in. He just called me out of the blue last week, and he's been living for the last 4 years, more or less, in China, a good deal of the time in Beijing. He informs me he's got the language down about 3/4 of the language skills to deal effectively in that. And he's an investment banker, and he's a Beijing based economist and also investment banker, and he's a dear friend, and so good to welcome you before you get on the plane going back to Beijing just any minute now. Yeah, really glad we could catch you. You just came in from Washington, busy as always, right? So good to see you. And why don't you share just a little bit of your background, real quick, just a few minutes. You're an investment banker. You've been involved in investment banking for a long time. You became interested in Beijing, but you've been there for the last 4 years.
That's right.
Haven't hardly heard from you except a couple of emails or something.
Yeah, it's pretty absorbing.
Yeah, right. Well,
especially you're learning language. And
yeah. But, okay, we're going to talk about that. We want to get your take on it because you really understand it very well from that position of having been there and everything. But let's share, because this program, I said to you, this program is going to air on Thursday, and we had a program that went before, somebody that you were interested in as an economist, and that being Robert Mundell, the father of supply side, a major economic figure, Nobel Prize winner and so forth, who influenced you, you studied with. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, Robert Mundell and the supply side, and just pure economic theory here before we get into thinking about things in China from an investment banker's perspective. Mundell was a major figure, and the supply side school of thinking of economic theory.
Right.
Lots gone under the bridge since you and I last saw 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes.
So, but let's talk it from a touchstone of Mundell.
Yeah, the latest chapter of it has been in China, but let me go back to the beginning. And of course, my relationship with him was at Columbia. I went to Columbia Graduate School for a PhD program in economics in the 90s, in the early 90s, and through that, I knew him in the department, and I've had a close relationship with him ever since. And in fact, I had a Chinese roommate at Columbia, and together we helped arrange, or I introduced him to Professor Mundell. And in the end, Mundell was invited to China.
Okay, because
he
of
helped arrange, and he went in 1995 for the first time.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
and that had an impact in China. But
when were you up there at Columbia? In the 90s?
92 to 97.
Okay, right. Okay.
Yeah, I went back to school late. I had an MBA, and I decided to, attempt a doctorate in economics.
Yeah, where'd you do the MBA?
At McGill.
At McGill, in Canada?
Yeah.
Oh, you get around. Where were you born?
I was born here.
In New York. Okay,
yeah,
good.
My mother's European, and when it came time to go to college, Montreal, it's like Europe. It's
close.
It
is like Europe.
And McGill's more or less on the British system, and so I could specialize in philosophy and mathematics. That was my undergraduate background.
Okay, right.
And then I did some work in actually philosophy and publishing and so on, and I worked for a publisher in Italy, and then got more serious, began to work for a French-Canadian bank, and did an MBA. And eventually, worked for several Canadian banks up there, and then we had the recession in '92, or the post-Gulf War and 91, 92. Actually, many will say due to the George Bush Sr. tax increases. Yeah. And I decided to go back to school. And it was after Tiananmen in China, and so we had quite a few mainland Chinese in the PhD program, so I befriended one, and we became roommates the second year.
And that's the one you introduced to Mundell?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And but before that,
Still in touch with that person?
Yes.
In China?
No, in fact, he's at the Hong Kong Monetary Agency. He has quite an important role there.
Right.
But Mundell's important, seminal. He's a Canadian. Canadians are leaders in international economics.
He's got a great sense of humor.
Oh yeah. He's on Letterman.
Right.
But dry Canadian sense of humor. Canadians, it's the Toronto comedians. Bellucci, the whole tradition, straight-faced comedy.
Yeah. But he's great. And he won the Nobel Prize, which was great.
Mundell, that's right.
And he was
for the partly not just supply side, but also for the euro, the fixed currency.
Okay, but the supply side. Because we have demand side, supply side are two ways of looking at economic theory and so forth. And he's father to the supply side.
Yeah, because...
And who has he influenced politically? Who are some of the
Reagan Revolution.
The Reagan Revolution,
yeah.
okay.
Now, some credit Arthur Laffer with the Laffer curve and so on, but they were at Chicago around the same time. But really, Mundell's the author of this, and it was first came in the John F. Kennedy administration, the famous Kennedy tax cuts.
Well, wait a minute. He was Kennedy tax cuts were. It was Walter Heller invited.
No, Walter Heller was the chairman of the Fed. They sent John Kenneth Galbraith to India. Heller was there.
That's right.
But this was based on a paper by Mundell.
It was
duly
really
credited.
No
yes,
kidding.
Yes.
Well, okay, that's
so it's a bipartisan.
I always associated with Walter Heller.
Supply side economics is bipartisan. You got Bill Bradley, you had Jack Kemp. Across the board, it's not necessarily a Republican thing.
Okay, talk about it. What does it mean?
Well, it's a little bit Keynesian because it's stimulative. It's a little bit Keynesian.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's stimulative. The idea is lower the tax rate and you stimulate the supply side of the economy, the investor side of the economy, which stimulates employment by lowering the tax rate and, in a sense, minimizing, but the process
playing
of
off the Laffer curve.
Lowering the tax rate. That's right.
That plays off Laffer
And what
curve.
it does is it transfers activity from government back to the private sector. Ronald Reagan used to love to say that 90% of the welfare dollars consumed by the welfare bureaucracy, and only 10% reaches the people.
Well,
so the idea is, you know, you're employing a huge public sector, of course, but the idea is to try to get as much of the of economic value to stay in the non-government or the private economy. The government doesn't need to be there as an agent. It's a consuming agent.
Mr. Reagan used to say the government is the problem, it's not the solution.
No? Yeah, or
so you got to think, if you may, you look at the world at large, you have two loci of power and influence in terms of the way the world works and has worked and everything, at least in the modern experience. On the one hand, you have corporate, profit, and private sector. And on the other hand, you have government, and then you have legislate, tax and spend, and regulate. And that's the loci of power and influence that we see on the news and all that sort of thing. For the most part, that's the way societies work. And so you have one side where the government is encouraged, on the other side you want to encourage the private sector. And the unregulated capability for the private sector to bring production to the economy.
Yeah, and then one of the issues is what's the motor of the economy? Is it the private sector? Is it the government? Is it planning? But I see it in a little slightly different.
Planning, you call it, right? But also regulating.
Or planning,
and
central planning.
Right.
Well, regulating
protecting the public.
Yeah,
against the egregious.
Regulating is more defensive versus a proactive. Sort of planning is more of the.
Yeah, it would include things like Social Security.
But there isn't an incompatibility.
Medicare.
Milton Friedman talked about rules. The need.
I wanted to ask you: was Milton Friedman influenced by Mundell, or what was the relationship?
No, he was elder. He was elder to Mundell.
He was elder, but
Mundell was a sort of upstart at
what was
Chicago.
the relationship between the two of them? Because
you're
familiar with both.
They
disagreed on what basic principles of economic theory?
On international exchange rates.
Exchange rates. In what sense did they disagree?
Friedman was a great proponent of floating exchange rates.
He was?
Yes.
We went floating in '74, didn't we?
Well, after the failure of the Nixon administration, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods and so on, the removal of the gold standard, and ever since then...
That was '74, right?
Early '70s, that's right.
Yeah, right.
And ever since then, volatile commodity prices. Oil prices are very low, very stable since then. And look at what we've had ever since then. And so there's a lot of discussion now. Mundell's time is back. It's not just China, which is what we've seen in the last 15 years, but now the talk of a new Bretton Woods following this crisis.
Well, who would that be? Bretton Woods is Keynes. Keynes was the
one.
Well,
yes, Keynes was the master. That's right. And the idea is and Keynes was in favor of this, a single fixed exchange rate system. And Mundell is very much a proponent of that. The euro, of which he's the father, and again, which he promoted in his young days in the '60s, is a fixed exchange rate among those European currencies.
And that's a major issue in terms of economic theorizing?
That's a major accomplishment. The euro is a great accomplishment, and it's so far successful.
Yeah,
well, we're seeing it stressed now, the issue of Greece, and there's a big stake in it. As I don't speak for Professor Mundell, but he once used to say that if it weren't for the euro, France and Germany will inevitably have a war again. So the euro is, in a sense, you know, I always say maybe Mandel should get the Nobel Peace Prize someday as a great peacemaker.
He got the Nobel,
No, he got the Nobel Prize in economics.
Oh, in economics.
But the Nobel Peace Prize, to the extent that the euro winds up being the guarantor, ultimately, of peace in Europe, in the sense that it would preempts war. If you think an inevitability war between the French and the Germans.
Yeah, it was happening with alarming regularity over historical pattern.
History.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that the Nobel Prize in Economics is independent of the others. It didn't come until 1969,
yes.
And it's sponsored by the bank.
Yes.
It's not sponsored by the same institutions that
right,
sponsor the Nobel Peace.
Yeah,
so it's
right.
done by the Economist. So and that's a way of giving you know, credence to certain ways of thinking and a heads up to certain of the academic economists and theorizing.
Yeah,
and so forth.
It tries to recognize the achievements in economics.
In 1972, Mr. Nixon said we're all Keynesians now.
Yeah.
And everything had come out of the Depression. We had the Depression.
Right.
That brought Social Security. That was fought by the market fundamentalists. They didn't want that. They didn't want anything to do with the government interfering with the market.
Wait a
They
minute.
fought it.
They fought the...
Social Security, when Roosevelt, New Deal, back in the 30s, when we were in the Depression.
The market fought especially tax increases.
Well, they would, yeah, tax.
By the way, let me mention this. When Roosevelt first campaigned, okay, against Hoover, Roosevelt campaigned as a supply-sider because Hoover had increased taxes.
How high were they under Hoover? They were up 70% under Eisenhower.
They were
right after the Second World War.
They were punitive.
Yeah,
this is another reason for the Kennedy tax cuts.
That's when
it took a Democrat to do that.
And that's when the Beatles made that song "Tax Man."
Yeah, right.
I'm the tax man.
But anyway, the strain. And by the way,
it's going into public sector to distribute and redistribute income to people who are on the lower end of the economic scatter. So the supply side benefits those who are wealthy, and the other is for the people who are poor by government intervention into the market, which is not good.
It stimulates investment, unless you think rich people just sort of live off the fat of the land.
Yeah, they do.
And spend their money.
They do.
No, they spend their time.
They don't.
They invest their money.
Well, they invest their money, but that's all going to be done by algorithms soon. They're not even going to be needed.
It's not that simple.
Well, no, it's not that simple. They want to make it complex. And they've just run the damn thing off the cliff that happened in 2008.
They have human judgment. They have wealth at stake. They make decisions about how to allocate this wealth, just as a bureaucrat would.
Why should
but
they
the difference is the bureaucrat
get,
uses other people's money, whereas the wealthy, it's their money. They care a lot about the efficient use of this.
We had emperors in Rome, didn't we, right? And the serfs were wallowing around in the mud, right? And then we had kings, and then we had serfs.
Well, that sounds a lot like government.
We had serfs.
Well,
we had
the feudal system, it's all governmental.
We had serfs in the feudal period and like that. And now, who is it that is representing the leadership element that sets up the template for the operation of Spaceship Earth? Seems to me it's the bankers. And what do? What is it that they contribute to where they get these huge bonuses and things like that? They put all the bonuses through. They got all the money. They live in castles. They live in things. They live a very large life. What is it that they do that is so valuable? I would like to know.
They allocate capital. They manage risk.
Okay, they manage risk. Okay.
Financial flows. It's very important. Financial flows are basically information.
So we're now run by the bankers. The world is run by the bankers. There's some sort of Illuminati kind of group of people who are the current leaders of the
As much as
emperors.
an accountant runs a corporation, I don't know if you're your bookkeeper, your accountant, you would say he runs your life, but it's a very important part of an economy.
So they're like bookkeepers.
It's the monetary economy. Yeah. Well, what I want to say is it's information. This is a financial world. It's information. It's keeping track. It's allocation.
And it depends on economic theory. Okay, and he said in 1972 we're all Keynesian. Now, what are we all now? What is the economic theory?
Well,
is it Mandel?
The Keynesians
or is it all anything? Or what is it that's operating the system to where we just went in 1908 in September? He came and he said, we got 3 pages, we have to make total change, and the whole economy fell apart. What is it that is motivating them to lead to that kind of a world where the world falls apart? We got 10% unemployment now and so forth. Who is the economic theory that is operating the political economy of the world?
We don't have a centralized
Is there a leading light?
system
Is there a
in the
leading
world.
lodestar? What is either we have a leading lodestar on both ends of the Republican and Democratic or progressive and conservative views of the economy and so forth? What are the leading lights? Would Mandel be one? supply side, or would it be Friedman?
I would want. Well, first of all, they had a very on Mundel's website. There's a debate between him and Friedman over this issue of fixed exchange rates or floating.
That's one issue.
It's an extremely important issue because it creates huge financial instability in the world.
Okay.
When you have these countries, the currencies are crashed, or the George Soroses of this world that go crash these
he does currency.
Well, now there's talk about Greece and talk about the euro and so on, and actions against that and so on. That's all allowed. That's all open game in a floating exchange rate regime.
Okay.
Now you don't need a
Tobin. You're talking about a number.
Don't need a Tobin tax and so on to avoid that. What you can if you fix the exchange rate, the exchange. Keynes had a not good idea. His not good idea was inflation is good because it fools the workers into believing they're making more money. All right. Well, and that wasn't a particularly good idea.
He's had a lot of good ideas. He was a hell of a
manipulating the exchange rate is a similar thing. Countries like to do this because they avoid the hard job of adjusting their own domestic fiscal policies accordingly. And who usually benefits from exchange rate changes, it was usually devaluations, were the rich in Latin America and these countries because their money is in Switzerland. The entrepreneurs, the middle class whose money is tied up in companies in those countries are always the losers. And that was often the IMF policy.
Muammar Gaddafi just declared a jihad against Switzerland over a personal matter and so forth.
Well, I mean, what?
And also, and then the thing is, okay, so we've had a thing, and one of the things that's happened, so I don't know what it is that does it, what it informs it. I don't know what role those people, those investment bankers, and the theoreticians, and the economic theorizing that informs the political process. What is it?
Listen, I'll tell you the banking system. It's not bankers per se. It's the human tendency to slacken off, to become uncritical, to go with the herd, to go with the crowd.
Okay.
All right? And so this happens in finance. And in investment banks, there's a lot of discipline. Even investment banks don't like to have staff among their or people among their staff that raise questions. They're very centralized. They're very committed organizations. And so there's a limited space
and that
in
applies
these organizations.
In China as well?
Well, it generally
China,
applies in business.
I think you're coming to understand the system in China.
And by the way, what happened in our system before? There were.
You mean Paulson in September 2008? Okay, no.
There were people warning about the mortgage situation, these things, but then. Those benefiting want to shut those people up and say, keep quiet because we're on a good thing. Okay, so you would see.
I notice all the bankers.
You would see people sort of blackball. They're contrarians who would say these are short sellers and so on, and they're spoilers. Yeah. So there is this kind of stress. It's a very natural human thing that happens in politics. You have a dominant group, and then you have you have peripheral types or people that expose or see things, and of course there's an attempt to marginalize it. So this happened in the financial world.
Everybody knew in the 1930s when we were in the depths of a deep depression that Mr. Keynes was the man, right? He was a giant figure. There were others. There was competition with Schumpeter, Van Hayek, I don't know, Hayek maybe, but there was some competition, but by and large, he was the man, and they were setting up Bretton Woods, everything was set up, and you were in the dire straits.
Post-war Bretton Woods,
right?
Architect is a different Keynes from the Keynes of the 1930s and the use of government and demand, stimulus, which didn't work. Because what did work was World War II and defense spending. Thanks to World War II, that pulled the economies out.
Daddy Warbucks.
What happened is Roosevelt raised taxes, so he committed his own mistake that brought there was a little bit of recovery in '36. Taxes increased and plopped down again. And then we had the war economy. Now Germany was going gangbusters.
They were
militarizing. I mean, Roosevelt was sending people over. They were sending people over to study the German economy.
Yeah, we were militarizing too then, and militarization is one way to get.
Well, we weren't doing that except
that's what brought us out of the depression, really.
Well, World War II.
World War II was a great boon for the economy.
And I hate to say this, but often disasters are. There's a silver lining with disasters. There's usually quite a bit of economic growth after a disaster because you have a lot of building, you have a lot of activity. There's a lot of things for the survivors.
Do you think we live at a time, Robert? Now we live, and let's get philosophical for a minute. We want to get to China for sure, because you've got a vast experience in there. Do you think we live at a time of qualitative transformation in large, comprehensive, is too small. They need another term, not a paradigm, not just paradigm, but a paradigm of paradigm of paradigm of paradigm of paradigm of paradigm shift.
It's too cosmic.
Now,
that's too cosmic.
You don't think so? Or you don't think that way? No sense talking about it.
No.
You don't think we live in a time of speciation or coming to a qualitative transformation in the evolution of human affairs?
I say that's cosmic. That's all encompassing.
Yeah.
How do you
begin to
observe this?
So that's comprehensive. That's comprehensive because that's the context in which everything's occurring, whether we want to specialize or not.
I tend to think there is no sort of overriding dominant movement. For example, I'm not a rejectionist, but I certainly believe in applying scientific criticism and refutation in the practice of global warming science.
Well,
in other words, that here there's an overriding process that's going to dictate a whole slew of economic.
I agree
and so
with you,
and there are issues about the global warming science has changed into law. Law is confirmationist. Law is preponderance of evidence. Lawyers try to amass evidence.
That's right.
Scientists do the reverse. Scientists are supposed to look for the counterexamples. Scientists are supposed to be their own worst enemies. My job as a scientist is to go out and try to
scientist, you're an economist. The economist can't
supposed to be a science, but anyway, your objective is supposed to try to disprove your own theory. Try to find a counterexample, and if you fail to find it, your theory stands. It's not going out and trying to make a court case for yourself.
Well, they were making a court case for.
And this is what's
but what I was trying to
tell.
That's why I was asking you about the large thing. That's one issue. I saw a thing on Google the other day. Large-scale people, even thinking people, are coming to. It's very worrisome. They're coming to distrust the scientific process itself.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
Distrust the.
They shouldn't distrust.
No, I'm trying to tell you, not the one issue because of that issue.
No, I understand.
But other things too.
Yes.
That all the peer review is set up by some people.
Right.
You have an Illuminati who runs the world. They sent and finance and set up all the templates, whether it's communism or wherever. They set up a template. The peer review is done. Lynn Margulis, our leading biologist, is now questioning the means, and Susan Mazur, who's a friend of ours, is questioning, is going along with her, that the way in which the peer review done, it has to fit the.
There's a lot of conformity. People.
So they're coming to distrust science or thinking. They're distrusting thinking.
Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Good idea.
Okay?
I think that's
in other
good.
words, there is we know scientific method and how it should be applied.
Yeah, it's being abandoned by a lot of thinking
and that's
people.
The key point. So
because it's being politicized.
So you don't want to reject science.
No.
You want to reject what's being misapplied or what's supposed to be science, but it's not proper science.
But there's a lot of bucks involved in those research things and all that.
But you don't attack it because it's science. You attack it because it's pseudoscience.
No, as you want to, like in the global warming, they want to get a bunch of bills out of Congress and so forth that prove something, and they tilt the scales.
Well, there's a whole career. These people all have careers. Are getting grants or getting all kinds of stuff.
And they're all getting grants, and that's the way. And everybody's a whore within the whorehouse of the system, all at the behest of the people who own all the assets and run everything like emperors in Rome. And they got economists who are apologists within a theory that gives them the power and so-called legitimacy in the historic pattern.
Look
and we hover on the brink of possible extinction. Do you think we hover on the brink of the extinction of our species?
How about a nuclear power accident? And how about environmentalists who used to be opposed to nuclear power, but now global warming has commandeered the environmental movement and turned it on its head. We're now environmentalism, as commandeered by global warming, now promotes the construction of nuclear power plants.
They're doing
in contradiction to.
Right. Well, do you remember one of the big changes? You remember how they used to run people put in jail for running numbers up in Harlem until the state realized that they could make money by, and they would say, it is a moral sin to gamble. You're taking the milk money and you're not giving the milk to the, and they had ads to that effect until they learned that they could make money on taxes. So now all of a sudden it's your duty to go out and gamble. You see, they will change with the winds of what it is political and so. But the informing of the political system by economists is important, and it's also that is too small. somebody once said, Robert, somebody said, wars are too important to be left up to the generals.
Right.
Economics is too important to be left up to the economists.
Well, I'll buy
because
that.
they're all put into little patterns where they don't think about things
Economists
and
haven't
what do these economists and these bankers do?
Economists haven't
They just
been very
operate
successful.
algorithms. It's all going to be done by algorithms.
Well, this is
soon.
one of the big problems. And,
all right.
And
so maybe we should get rid of economists.
Haven't been very. Well, you don't have to get rid of them. You can just ignore them.
Well, it's hard to do because they got such power. Look at Mr. Paulson went in and pulled this stunt in. In 3 days we got to have a bill through Congress, or the whole world's going to fall.
Listen to me.
And they had to bail out, and they still got their big bonuses.
I will explain what happened with that TARP. Okay, this came in early October. Okay, I remember that weekend. I was giving a speech.
No, it was September 20. I wrote about it. I wrote about it on the 21st of September.
The 3 days of TARP. This was after the
first
first weekend in October.
September 20 is the date.
At the first weekend in October, and I'll tell you why. I gave a speech at the 50th anniversary of the Petroleum University of China. I just remember.
Right. Yeah, I know. We got to get to
remember
China.
Before I went there, I saw this devastating news on the internet that Citigroup was now in play. In the following way, Wachovia was, the Fed was quietly arranging for Citigroup to take over Wachovia.
Yeah,
but lo and behold, Wells Fargo steps up.
Yeah.
And by the way, it would have involved some government assistance. Lo and behold, that weekend, Wachovia steps up and says, we want to buy, I'm sorry, not Wachovia, Wells Fargo steps up and says, we want to buy Wachovia, and we don't need any government assistance. And that threw a spanner in the works. And then everything was out, the news was out, that Citigroup needs, Wachovia needed, they needed each other, Citigroup needed to combine with those Wachovia assets, and it needed to have that government help.
Who is that?
The reason I say that put Citibank.
Was that Sanford for a while?
No, it's Vikrat Pandit. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Now, that began to put
Sanford.
Now listen, that meant if the Wells Fargo transaction goes through, now Citibank is tainted. Now Citibank is in play. Yeah. And there's a collapse of Citibank. What happened is, up until that point, the government was considering taking over these bad loans. Those bad loans need to be analyzed. You need to have a staff of people. It takes a long time. Suddenly they said, now we only have a matter of days. We don't have time to take over these bad assets. We have to do what the British have done. We've got to take equity in these banks and put equity in them, or near equity, which is what Brown had done in the UK. And in those 3 days, they had Congress do that. That's why that sudden movement, because they saw there wasn't any time now, especially at Citibank was now a potential.
Oh yeah, it was an incredible time.
That was a crucial 3 days.
Yeah, and they said it was going to fall off the end. Now, one of the problems is we only got so much time.
And that was the worst that came, by the way. You know, in the bankers' acceptance market, all the short-term liquidity market, that was the very worst time when you see the graphs. After that beginning of October, and they got through this, things started to settle down.
Okay, listen, the problem is we haven't got enough time, okay? You don't understand. We could talk 17 hours.
Yeah,
I'm sorry you're here for a weekend. You come in from Beijing, for crying out loud, and we got to get around to you. I know. And you had all the swaps and derivatives and everything, but we don't want to go into it. Now, you've been, for the last 4 years, and you are an expert, I know, on electricity, which is a huge thing, and you've been teaching that. I guess, how did you come to be in Beijing? Tell us about it. How are things in China these days? Is the little brook still running there?
Well,
tell me, how are things in Beijing, and introduce us how you got to be there and what you're doing, okay?
Okay, well, you mentioned electricity. Yes, I
was very
active in this country and with the Japanese.
I know.
Okay,
I know.
We know what happened.
You've written enormously.
The Japanese economy sort of, plateaued and started for quite a while, and we had a blackout in 2003.
In China?
No, in the Northeast. Remember, in New York?
Oh yes, I do remember. I had to climb in a window.
And so I was very much involved in the diagnosis of this blackout.
I know you
and so
were.
New York Times quoted me a lot of times. And one of those New York Times articles I found was republished by China State Power.
Okay.
Actually, it was called State Power USA. It's a subsidiary of the State Grid Corporation of China, which operates most of the electric grid in all of China. And so it signaled to me that they have a presence here. I contacted them for a few years. From then on, I did some work for them, some advisory work like I had done with the Japanese. And then came a conference here in New York in 2005. We started to see conferences here on China. Normally, you know, Asian finance, that's not something you would see handled out of New York.
Well, they are growing at a
but,
rapid
you know,
rate.
there were hedge funds. There's already a lot of money here
buying
from Asia.
all our T-bills.
And that's important. And so some people asked me for some ideas about a conference they were holding in Beijing. I looked at the agenda, I saw exchange rates. I said, you should invite Professor Mundell for this. He's over at China all the time.
Yeah, right.
So they asked me to, you know, if I could help them, say, propose to him. So ultimately he agreed. And so they said, well, since he's, you know, he's going to be our, you know, keynote. Why don't you?
Would be,
They invited me to go as well as a speaker.
To go along with
and
it as
because
a speaker.
I had some possible pending business with the State Grid. I had bid on a consulting project. I thought it would be helpful for me to be in Beijing in case they had some questions to ask me.
Yeah, right.
And so I went over there. I didn't win the project or the bid. We were behind Siemens.
Sometimes you win,
group.
sometimes
you
don't.
come in second. It's not good enough.
Right.
But then they asked me to teach at the Electric Power University.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, I taught power systems.
That was attended upon the meeting that you were there with Mr. Mundell?
No, it was totally separate. So I went there. I went there to speak at a conference, and I wound up.
You were down in Taiwan
and I didn't
for
go
a while.
Home. That was a year before.
You were involved with a young lady?
No, it was some. I'd given some presentations to the power system, to the electric power company there.
Okay, huge subject.
Well, because they had also they were considering reviving their power market. You know, after the California fiasco, everybody had stopped, and so they were. You know, so I spent a month there. But I was thinking of going to the mainland, but then the time wasn't right, and so I waited for a year, and then this opportunity came up. So I didn't come home after the conference. I wound up staying there.
You ended up leaving your house? Your house? You didn't even get the house? You got the house? It's been empty?
It's still here. Yeah, it's still in there. So I wasn't sure how long I was going to stay. So anyway, it's been there here, and then, you know, one thing led to another. I've been still advising the State Grid on how to continue the market reform and set up energy markets and trading, and to get the you know, to make energy supply and demand efficient.
You were teaching there now you're talking Beijing. Right?
Yeah, in Beijing. I taught for a year in 2006.
Where?
I taught at the Electric Power University.
Big university, part of their...
Yeah, it's the Electric Power. They have universities that are sort of grouped by subject area.
Okay.
And sometimes they were owned by the monopoly state company that would run that. Like the Petroleum University was actually operated by the State Petroleum Company.
Isn't everything sort of owned by the
Communist Party? It's all kind of been broken up, but yeah, there's still some nominal. The Communist Party is the personnel manager of China.
Okay.
They have a personnel department that approves all senior corporate, and even in some private companies, all senior corporate positions are vetted by the Communist Party.
Okay, now private sector, public sector. Government is public sector.
Yeah.
Private sector?
The private sector is
how does it work?
Yeah. So the Chinese...
I have the opinion that the Communist Party runs everything. Sets all the policy.
No, it doesn't run, in a sense, everything.
Okay,
but
talk to us about it.
It has its hands in the important parts of everything.
Okay.
Okay. And it sort of reserves a right, but it doesn't actively seek to, you know, it tries to, in some sense, minimize the amount of intervention it needs to make, but it's very concerned about stability.
Are they?
And survival as a party and survival in power, and their key. They recognize this, and the key factor is economic growth.
Okay,
they know
they've been growing,
they're wedded to the idea that without economic growth, there will be social instability, and the party may not remain in power. So they are committed to sustained economic growth.
And
the level considered for the longest time was maybe 8 or 9%, and you know, for a time before the crisis, we were seeing 11-12% growth over there. Yeah. And actually now, even during and after the crisis, it's turned out to be larger than people expected. But the way they approach the crisis, I have an issue with, and they've been the most successful.
The crisis of 2008, you mean?
2008 and 2009. That's right. Yeah, and what they did was, I get back to Rahm and Manuel, you know, don't waste a crisis. But what they did was to take was to take the easy way to solve the problem, and in a way, sometimes you have to do that for a while. So they had the banks, which the state controls, lend money, huge amounts of money for infrastructure projects, basically to local governments, to build capacity, build roads, build railways, build buildings, all kinds of stuff. But the problem is it may not be used for quite a while. So in other words, we're seeing a potential problem in China of overcapacity. Now, we have huge loans now that are backing
infrastructure
this.
You're talking about?
All kinds of infrastructure stuff, capacity, buildings, okay? It's one thing to build stuff. The Chinese are the world's experts at construction. Goes back to the 50s. Chairman Mao, China reconstructs. Chinese are the world's crackerjacks, best builders.
Really?
But they are not the world. But they are not the world champions at using buildings, at using infrastructure. They don't really know how to use it because that's software. China's run by engineers, not software engineers and computers. Those are younger guys. It's run by material engineers. Remember, materialism, Marxism, Darwinism.
That's what I want to ask you.
They like hands-on stuff. They like equipment. And China can do this masterfully. The problem is once you've spent that out, you got to think about doing things that you're not as expert in, like figuring out how do we use this capacity? How do we stimulate parts of the economy that are going to use this capacity? The problem is with this accelerated level of capacity, and the huge level of loans, they may have a problem of earning enough income from that capacity to repay the loans, and they likely won't. You know, the real estate vacancy rate in Beijing is the same as it is in California. California is the worst
high is that
as it ever been, like 40%.
How much?
40%.
Commercial or residential or both?
Well, commercial, maybe.
Yeah,
but residential too. High-end residential, same.
Is that high? I've heard that there's parts of Manhattan that high.
Well, it can't. But California is the same, but coming from the opposite direction.
Yeah.
You know, we've got, it's not new stuff was built, it's a demand fell away. In China, it's because they're just running ahead of themselves.
They're also buying all our T-bills. They're also putting a lot of money into our debt.
I'll explain that.
But let me ask you something.
Let me finish the story. Okay, the crisis comes as they can't make enough from the economy, from the usage of all this capacity to repay the bank loans. The local governments don't earn a lot from property tax. Property tax is not a big thing in China. Local governments earn money by selling land for projects. Right, they sell land and they hoard the land and they release it a little at a time because they want to make sure they get the most money from that land. That's partly driving the real estate bubble in China because governments, they could solve that immediately. Local governments could just release a huge amount of land, but that's their piggy bank. So what will happen is as they have problems servicing...
Makes you think of Henry George.
Well, that's another issue. As they have problems servicing those loans, the local governments will have to release more land. And when they release more land, that'll cause the land price to stop increasing and probably you'll start to see a turning point where land prices start to decline because governments are having to release more land in order just to service the loans. In other words, they'll use that to put equity in those companies, those local government-controlled companies that own this infrastructure, just to pay the banks. So property would tend to be depressed by lack of income generation by those properties and the fact that supply of property is now getting more and more and depressing the supply of land will begin further depressing the value of the property. That's where China can face a problem. We don't know when that can happen, but you know, once we fix
that happen to Japan, or what happened in Japan?
Yeah, and I tell the Chinese all the time.
It was absurd.
I tell you know, the best thing to tell the Chinese, don't do like the Japanese. They listen to that. And this is one of the dangers that there's been a tendency, even with Hu Jintao's idea of harmony. That's the Japanese concept of wa. You know, he has some Buddhist influence because he was in Tibet and so on, but I warn the Chinese to be very careful. I said, you know, they have lots of money. Yeah, they could follow the Japanese model. The Japanese have are learning to do without. They've had government build all kinds of useless projects and so on. Actually, Keynes taken to the extreme. That's the case. All right? and doing without. I said, China,
and they definitely didn't want to have unemployment.
The Chinese could do this as well and get by for years and years. But do you want to know what? The individual Chinese will never put up with it because they've been conditioned. They expect, and when the Chinese they expect 8% growth a year. They have to create 10 million jobs a year for all these university graduates and people. And if they slacken off, you get problems. You're talking about real potential problems. Those leaders in China are thinking and worrying about this every day. So does the Communist Party.
You've got the language down. You got about 3/4. You told me you really can communicate well and everything. And
I can't give a speech.
You give a speech in Chinese?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay,
year.
but you're getting there.
Next year,
and you have a wide connection of friends
more
and
more,
associates that you've
I
made
avoid foreigners.
over there.
I avoid foreigners.
And you're academic. Are you doing any investment banking consulting?
Well, what I do is policy stuff involving energy and some financial stuff because the energy side is very important in China. And in the process, in the process, because it's very important that for all the, not paying tribute to government, what the rules of the road are in the end are very important for business. And I think it's important to devote time to getting these rules straight and correct.
Well,
then facilitating transactions later on the basis.
Okay, help me out. I saw Mr. Hu the other day talking to the Communist Party, and he said, "We're Marxists. We're socialists. We're following, and the religion is Marxism." Do they still teach Marxism?
They do.
And do they still try to claim to be Marxist?
Yes.
Do they represent the socialist critique of the capitalist environment, or do they try to do that? Or what has been their relationship to what would the progressive community of the world, such as it is, if there's any remaining and everything like that, how would they relate to what's going on in China? Because it looks terribly like a run-of-the-mill sort of capitalist situation. And do they still try to claim Marx, a Western import? And why are they so upset with anything spiritual or anything that might be a threat to their power base? And are they concerned when they look over their left shoulder or their Western shoulder at what happened in the Soviet Union after the Soviet Union imploded? From a Marxist perspective, and became openly capitalist.
Well,
why don't they just say we're capitalist? Or why do they still claim Marx? And what are they trying to do? Is it a propaganda thing? Or what is going on in their head when they think that they're representing the proletariat of the world, when they got gated communities and capital accumulation and all the rest of it?
You're absolutely right.
So could you explain it to me? What do you think from being on the inside? What's going on in terms of their psychology?
I think the way you read Marxism and socialism is it's just a name for what exists.
Okay. No, spell it out. Because
it's a name for what exists, and it's a commitment to preserving as much as possible what exists, while at the same time generating 8% economic growth. So to which I say, good luck.
Okay.
Okay.
But that's their religion. And in the end, that's their religion.
But
it's like their religion.
Yes, but listen to me.
They don't want to hear anything about any Lao Tzu or any Confucian or anything else.
There's a resurgence of interest in all that.
Is there now coming? They're allowing that?
Listen to me.
What are they doing to the what do you call it, Falun Gong and everything? And
well,
any protests.
The issue of the Falun Gong is more. First of all, there are issues about is it scientific or not. And before they banned Falun Gong, they had certain people in the media campaigning and trying to demonstrate how Falun Gong isn't scientific and so on and so forth, which is fine.
They still claim science.
But the key
they're still trying to claim science.
I don't think the fact that they're anti-scientific made them, of interest to state security. But I think what happened is
of dialectical material.
The issue is it's an organization, and the party isn't geared up yet, and it's gradually trying to figure out how to deal with NGOs. For example, the earthquake in Sichuan, the party youth, who would be the ones out there volunteering, they weren't able to handle the demand, so they had to allow NGOs and private people to form groups and to go out there and help out.
It's very oppressive,
and so they're trying to come to terms with how do we sort of, live with other organizations, because the issue is if you allow other kinds of organizations, eventually they can compete with you.
Your power base of the political power of the Communist Party that runs everything, right?
Yeah, well, there's concern that in the end they'll boil it down to maintenance of order.
So how does the private sector operate there? How would an entrepreneur operate in terms of that? They have to have inside track to the communist commissar or something, or how does it work?
Listen to me.
Listen, tell me.
The Chinese economy is still very centralized in many respects.
Okay.
Okay. What happened is Deng Xiaoping created a whole new sector of the
Money
economy.
is good.
Okay,
Yeah.
but he
Profit
liberated
is
the
good.
peasants. Listen to me, no system, and so go back to your Marxists and so on. But the proof of the road is how many people in so short a time, hundreds of millions of people. How many people in so short a time, within decades, within a generation, have been pulled up from poverty?
Is that true? Or that is a true
this
fact?
This is unprecedented.
They're up from poverty,
This
right?
is unprecedented in the history of the world, okay?
Okay.
All right. Now, now it's a process. Deng Xiaoping began what I tell the Chinese is the first 30 years. We just finished it. His idea was, and he convinced the party elders, we're going to create a whole new sector, and it's going to take care of the rest of the economy. We don't have to change that. This sector is going to be a manufacturing sector. They started by letting farmers form companies in the countryside, competed with state-owned companies who couldn't keep up with demand. Eventually, those state-owned companies, sort of crashed. The second stage was they invited multinationals to come in. Okay? In the coastal areas to make and employ all these farmers, the migrant workers, 200 million farmers, or well, it's 20 million, anyway, tens of millions of farmers, and we have the migration of the countryside, from the countryside to the urban areas, which is in a couple of hundred million people.
That's characteristic.
Yeah, we know all the super growth of developing kind comes from this migration from the farm to the countryside. So you had this liberation of the farmers, rising income, everybody's happy, based on the second stage was of this sort of first Deng Xiaoping's stage of the transformation was sell for export, sell to the United States, cheap goods and so on.
Well, everything's made in China now.
So this is good for everybody because it helped our economy. How did we keep inflation low here? Look at the Mexicans. Go to a Walmart sometime late at night and look at the people who are buying TVs and stuff who could never dream of having that before.
How does the money get to
priced.
people? How does money get to people? I was from Detroit. They had to organize the unions. They had to fight like hell in order to get a decent wage because the people were accumulating
Well, these
capital.
are issues in China. Wages should be higher in China.
How does money get to the people?
Chinese companies, to state-owned companies today, and they're still there, especially those companies lock up
Are they competitive?
They lock up too much money in the company and don't pay enough to the workers. This is an issue. And this is something that's being recognized. There are lots of opinions and a lot of debate in China, especially on economics. Economics is pretty well open field.
You said millions of people who've been brought up out of poverty. How do the people get money?
Their salaries. They're being paid.
Salaries.
Or, and private businesses. They're earning money.
That's what I'm asking.
Doing all kinds of things.
And they're allowing the entrepreneurial Schumpeter
thing. It is the
thing.
growth of this private sector that has carried the Chinese economy, not the state sector. The state sector has withered or stayed. But what happened is the government has designated certain basic industries, electricity, energy, infrastructure, transport, as national champions. In some cases, given them semi-monopolies and so on, hoping to build a critical mass, keep out foreign companies and so on, give them a critical mass, maybe they can spread around the world and so on. I think those hopes are hopeless. But and to corporatize these, have them issue shares, make them try to develop into. But the point is, they're still centrally controlled. There's still a
centrally controlled. I mean by the Communist
Party by planning, yes. In terms of energy, for example, the energy sector, there was still regulation of energy prices. Energy prices were woefully too low in China, but Chinese leaders and politicians are too afraid to raise them to world level. Gasoline is too cheap. That's why we had a huge...
Still is?
Well, they recognize this, and gradually they realize they need to have an energy market at prices that are comparable to the rest of the world, but they wanted to do it slowly because they're deathly afraid of people going out in the street and complaining.
Are they afraid
but what I tell them
to do... Are they afraid of massive uprisings? And
well,
and why are
we
they
have
so
issues
repressive?
We have issues...
Why are they
I'll
so
explain
repressive?
this. I'll explain this. And I tell them, don't lowball prices. If you're worried about poor people, just give them a subsidy on the side. Just pay them money. But let them pay the true price of energy so they'll at least adjust their demand. They won't use excessive amounts of it. China is the marginal price setter in the world oil market. And I surmise that if China hadn't regulated energy prices, had they been at a global level since 2002, that the world oil price might have peaked at $100 instead of $150. If it had been $100, Bernanke might not have tightened interest rates in the early 2008, because suddenly people started to worry about inflation, and we might not have had a financial crisis. So China plays its role in that. Subsidies, artificially low prices, this kind of price control doesn't work.
Why are they
social
so
disorder
oppressive?
is
Why
land.
are they so oppressive in terms of human rights? Why is it? I saw a thing on television where Tiananmen Man in front of the tank that they showed university students. They've never seen the picture. How can they be so oppressive and in violation of human rights? The fellow was just put in prison for doing. Why is it that they have to be that way? And will it ever be that way? Will it ever loosen? Or what is the reality?
I want to tell you something. It's even that way in Japan. The Japanese are
in
never...
Japan. It's that way here,
not
too.
human rights. I don't want to say that
human
way.
rights,
Listen,
understand
what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
The Japanese would criticize us for over-lawyering, to have too much law, too much. You know, the Japanese, and it's an Oriental tendency to try to settle things among yourselves. Don't litigate, okay? Don't have to use. So consequently, in China,
who is that? Is that
this
Oriental?
is an Oriental.
Oriental.
Thing, okay, yeah.
Thanks. Okay.
And in China, there is a sort of thing. There isn't a legal system to sort of adjudicate things. There's an expectation that people should settle these things among themselves and so on. You have a police, so you don't have enough lawyers. You don't have courts that could possibly absorb the demand. If you allow people to litigate and complain, they don't have the infrastructure.
We're probably too legit.
Well, that's the issues, okay? But they don't have this infrastructure. They need to develop it. There are people in the party, the arguments in the party are always about how fast you do this. You have the security guys that want to go slow because they want to protect jobs. They don't like a lot of these new sectors, and they try to say if it weren't for the security we maintain, we wouldn't have this economic miracle. So if you economic guys pressuring us to reform and to let up on the control, you know, be careful, because if we let up too much, you have too many people going to courts. We'll have courts flooded. We don't have enough judges. China's got to train an army of lawyers. Now, look at the police force. They're low paid. They're not happy on their jobs. They don't smile. You get a leader that comes up and tells them, hey, go after this guy over there. When those police go arrest this dissident or whatever, or have to monitor him, they're not happy. They got enough work on their hands that they have some leader on their back telling them to go to do this. So they mistreat prisoners.
Why is the leader doing that?
Because the leader's doing that, because the party is you know, there are people in the party that they have a policy of what they call nipping in the bud. So they want to sort of minimize control.
Yeah.
And so they believe that if they catch the leader very early, so it's called overreaction, like too early, too soon, too much too soon.
Nip it in the bud.
Too late.
There's a term. Nip
too
it
much
in the bud.
too soon. So they'll identify like Liu Xiaobo.
Yeah.
So instead of they know they can't arrest all, you know, there's huge dissension and debate in the academic community and among the writers and the artists in China.
Are there avenues for it?
But listen, but they talk to bloggers in this, but nobody can arrest them all anymore. They can't do that in China. So
where's it leading
So the
to?
policy is find one guy, make an example of him. So they put this guy. The other people, you know, they had a charter 88, that this guy was the author. You know, it was signed by 10,000 people. They haven't touched anybody else. They just pick one guy now. They think this can be enough of an example to sort of temper people down and to sort of keep things, you know, sort of keep the lid on the pressure because of the fear. The fear is that they don't know how to handle all this stuff. But the problem is, it's an old story. If you keep sweeping under the rug, if you keep doing this, you know, the pressure. You got to seriously think about developing mechanisms to handle this.
And do you think they also have an eye upon what happened in Russia? Well, what happened in Russia? What happened in Russia was kleptocracy.
Well, you know,
they got a GDP down to about Portugal or something like that. It just fell apart, despite all of the things.
Yes, and by the way, there's a difference between China and Russia.
Okay, but they're both commies.
Yeah, but Russia's gangland. Russia, you know, and China's
not.
China, they lock you up. But at least they don't, you know, in Russia, some guys just assassinate journalists and so on. But that doesn't happen in China. The worst thing is the police come and arrest you, they throw the key away for a few months.
Is the Chinese leadership totally in accord with what is thought of as the legitimate interests of the United States of America?
Well,
do you see any opposition to the legitimate order by which this planet is operating, so-called, with the International Monetary Fund and all the institutions in place?
Listen to me.
Is there any need for there to be an opposition to the system that's in place on a paradigm shifts? I suggest to you, I think it might be coming out of academic Islam.
No,
I know you can't see it because it doesn't make sense. But
the China issue is
that's the enemy du jour now. The commies are now in our camp.
When Islam
the commies are now our buddies.
Listen,
we're all with the commies. That's over, right? Remember Kennan?
When the Islamic George Kennan, listen,
yeah.
Listen. When the Islamic world's more than 3% of the world economy, it's like more like 30%.
Yeah, but they're 50. They're 25, 30% of the world population.
Well, think of what they are.
And they're also the enemy du jour. Do you notice? Do you know? No, but do you make anything out of that?
No.
No,
a small part.
Like commies.
The
enemy of the
fundamentalists.
They're the one that allows us to run our system, and we claim legitimacy.
Oil, for Christ's sake.
Is there any threat to the legitimacy of the order that's set up by the United States of America, by and large, with what Marxists would call their running dog allies, because that system is out of focus with what the future requires? I'm going to suggest to you they got a thing coming out of Islam that ties into binary economics, and it is tying into the proscription against usury that we've gotten around and build a whole system.
I want to go to a topic you brought up, the U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay, they're all held by China.
Well, it's like an embrace. It's like a marriage. You can't break up this marriage. Okay, there's a lot at stake. Okay, well, it's not too big to fail.
Well, there's too much debt. I mean,
we have debt. One of the problems.
Are they going to be able to play us
the problem
like a
with China is the Chinese don't know how to invest in anything but Treasury bonds. They don't know, but although they
still
do,
a good investment.
They do. But let me tell you the punchline.
You're an investment
The
banker.
Chinese do
Isn't
not.
a Treasury bond one of the safest investments in the world?
Yes, it is, because it's the most liquid thing you can buy and sell. It's got the deepest
So it's very liquid. And
well, because the U.S. is a deficit country
so that's
in
why
terms of trade deficit, and the dollars are held over. It started out with the Marshall Plan, where we had lots of surplus.
I want to warn you, we only have about a minute and a half left of this whole thing. So get whatever you want to get. What soundbite you want to get in now.
The Chinese need to invest in things other than Treasury bonds. They need to do more direct investment in the United States. They cannot do what's called foreign direct investment because they don't know how, which means set up company, like have Chinese multinational companies. There never was, there isn't, and there never will be a Chinese multinational company.
Why?
Because they don't know how to do it.
Why would they not know how? They're smart. They got a 5,000
historically, they never did it. They were never expansionist. I'm not worried about Chinese imperialism.
That's true.
They're like America. They're isolationists. We're isolationists. America is a superpower.
Well, we seem to have gotten
America
over that.
is a superpower by default, not by design.
Oh, well, that's your assumption.
And the Chinese are very similar to us in the sense that they're inward looking. This is the Middle Kingdom. They're self-sufficient. The U.S. is a huge economy. Trade, that's peripheral. The reason Mundell's a great international economist because for Canadians, Canada is the most open, small economy in the world. Canadians are very alert to international. Okay, so there's a similar. So I'm not worried about Chinese military or Chinese
in the studio because we're running out of time.
But the Chinese are great portfolio investors. They're individualists. It's not Confucianism. It's Taoism. It's Lao Tzu. It's what's called the family state, not the city state.
And it's Karl Marx.
Marx.
That's their religion.
That's nobody. Ask the
Do
Chinese.
they make a joke about it?
Nobody defines.
Can you make a joke about it and get away with it?
Nobody defines anything.
Have they got any comedians who are saying, "What are you talking, Marx"? Haven't they got any Marx Brothers over there, or Three Stooges?
The day they have Saturday Night Live in China, China's really come out of.
Bobby, it's so good to see you. Sorry, we only got started. We could talk for hours. Your pleasure. I have the perceptions of Robert Blohm. Then he's a Beijing-based economist and investment banker. Been living there for 4 years. Got the language down almost to where he can start giving speeches to them rather than just taking it all in.
No, I give speeches in English, but it's better
I
Chinese.
said you're getting the language of Chinese down to where you'll be able to do that by the next time you come back. You're only in town for a couple days or something.
Yeah, I gotta go
so
back
good.